Kia ora.
I'll call the member next. Members, at the beginning of this debate, Grant Robertson queried whether the commencement date in the bill was in order. A commencement date must provide certainty about when the Act is to come into force. It may not rely on an indeterminate event, and that's Speaker's Ruling 130(2). Clause 2 of the bill provides that it comes into force on the date appointed by the Governor-General by Order in Council. That is a relatively common method of providing for a commencement of an Act. However, it goes on to say that the date of the Order in Council must be the date on which the TPPA enters into force for New Zealand. That is an unusual feature. It is important that the House knows, when it is legislating, the determinant event that will cause a bill to come into force. The House must also ensure that where a bill commences by Order in Council, that the Executive Council knows when it must act. It does not seem to me that the event that would cause this bill to come into force lacks clarity. It is always possible that the TPPA or any other treaty will not come into force if member states do not agree with it. However, the bill provides that if the treaty does come into force, then the Order in Council bringing the bill into force must name the same date for commencement. The commencement provisions, in my view, make it clear what event would cause the bill to come into force, but not whether it will come into force. That is a matter somewhat beyond the control of this House. I am satisfied that the current commencement date does not infringe against standing Speaker's Ruling 130(2). As I noted earlier, the commencement date is already part of the bill, recommended by the Select Committee and agreed by the House at the second reading. While this committee could amend the commencement date, and I could rule on the relevance of an amendment, it is not within the power of the chairperson to rule out of order something already agreed by the House. However, for the reasons I have just given, that is not a course of action that needs to be contemplated. I call Eugenie Sage.
E te manga te whare tēnā koe. Thank you, Mr Chair, for that clarification. But I guess it's like a lot of things in this bill. It gives the power of the executive greater power than the power of the Parliament. And I'll come on to talking about that in a moment in terms of the changes to the Overseas Investment Act. But would like to start, because before Mark Mitchell spoke, it seemed obvious that the National Party backbench were stuck like limpets to their seats and really unwilling to rise and defend this bill, given the huge public opposition to it and the opposition from this side of the House. And I think, Mr Chair, it is a bit rich now that the Minister, Honourable Todd McClay, is conducting a trade refresh with businesses, iwi and the public, because it's rather too late to be consulting about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and trying to restore the faith of the community in the government's negotiations of trade agreements when we have this bill before the House and when the whole process of negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement has been so mired in excessive secrecy by both officials and by the commercial side. The public hasn't been allowed to see the text until very, very late in the process. It was a 6,000-page text. The submitters got very little time to consider that before the date for closure of submissions. That whole process within the Select Committee for deliberating on the bill was truncated by about a month, and we've had a very different process here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, than that which has existed overseas, like in places like Canada, where there is much more extensive public consultation and public engagement on trade agreements. And it's the Green Party's view that there should be a non-binding referendum on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that we should engage the public and not have the executive able to negotiate these agreements without actually having the Parliament even able to consider them and consider whether they should be signed. So this bill is making changes to legislation. The Parliament hasn't had a chance to express itself, other than by the Select Committee report, on the actual agreement itself and veto the executive or engage in that debate there. Mr Speaker, this is a noxious bill. As my colleague Barry Coates described, the government has gone after it because it believes that the economic benefits from it are substantial. But the analysis that's being done has shown that it's within the margin of error in terms of any economic benefits within the normal flux of the economy. So it's not guaranteed to deliver the claimed benefits that the government talks about. And one of the major disadvantages of the agreement, of course, is the investor-state dispute provisions. Because this agreement, supposedly about trade, only has 6 of its 27 chapters which deal with tariffs. The bulk of it is actually dealing with investor rights. And it's those investor rights that will fetter the ability of the government to actually pass legislation to protect New Zealand's interests. So the government has gone into this talking about economic interests, but it's been prepared to put second the ability of the Parliament to regulate, the ability of the Parliament to legislate on behalf of all New Zealanders, because it is allowing, through these investor-state dispute provisions, for private corporations to sue the government, to preempt a judicial process, and to have huge corporations taking on our small government. Because, Mr Chair, of the 100 largest economies, 50 are countries and 50 are corporations. New Zealand is 364th in that list. We're 54th amongst governments. So when private corporations seek to sue the New Zealand government, as companies like Chevron have done when the state of Quebec decided that it didn't want any more gas fracking, the oil company Chevron sued the Canadian government for almost $400 million. Similarly, in Ecuador, where Chevron used the investor-state dispute provisions to try and get out of a previous ruling that that government had put in place to stop Chevron polluting the Ecuadorian environment. So it is this undermining of national sovereignty, the undermining of the power of Parliament, that is at the heart of the Green Party's, Mr Chair, of the Green Party's opposition to this bill, because it will allow foreign corporations to seek compensation from the government if they see things like mining legislation, things like biodiversity standards, things like controls on land use to protect water quality, actually undermining their rights and their investment certainty. So it's going to have a chilling effect potentially on the Parliament. One of the other major reasons for the Green Party's opposition is the changes in the bill around the Overseas Investment Act in Part 7. And again, Mr Chair, this is where the executive is giving itself the power to amend the threshold which triggers the Overseas Investment Office to look at private corporations seeking to purchase New Zealand companies and getting involved in the New Zealand economy. Under the TPPA, there's a requirement that the government double the threshold from $100 million in the current legislation, which triggers the scrutiny of the Overseas Investment Office, to $200 million. But the bill in Part 7 allows the government to pass regulations to change that investment threshold at the say-so of the executive. So that is having subsidiary secondary legislation power done through regulation rather than through primary legislation, which is debated by the Parliament. So, Mr Speaker, that again is reducing the sovereignty of Parliament. It is reducing our ability to protect our economy against foreign investment. And one of the other major weak provisions of the bill is that we cannot extend the categorisation of assets and land holdings which are subject to the Overseas Investment Act. So that means that there is no ability for the Parliament to ensure that foreign speculators who are speculating in urban residential property can be controlled through a change to the Overseas Investment Act. The bill prevents that from happening. So it's keeping the classes of legislation which are subject, the classes of transactions which are subject to the scrutiny of the Overseas Investment Office. It restricts those to what is already in the legislation. Again, Mr Chair, a chilling of Parliament's ability, a restriction on our national sovereignty, a putting of the interests of foreign corporations ahead of the ability of the Parliament to act on behalf of all New Zealanders, to act on behalf of our economy. So it's the foreign corporates who win under this bill. It is the views of masses of New Zealanders who made submissions on the agreement that they oppose this bill. We oppose this bill. We want our Parliament to have sovereignty. We want our Parliament to be able to act on behalf of all New Zealanders to protect our environment, to protect our economy against overseas speculation and investment. But this government is set on undermining that so that foreign corporations are much more able to sue and pursue their interests. The Green Party is opposed to this bad bill.